I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Nir Eisikovits, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies.
Dr. Hughes, good morning.
How are you, sir?
Not bad, not bad. We are going to talk about long-termism today, but before we do, a great innovation in our podcast full of innovations, we now have an email. So we have officially arrived in 1996.
Well, we were trying to keep this thing under wraps, but now we actually have people listening to us. So we thought there might be a way for them to communicate with us.
Exactly. So the email is prostheticgods@gmail.com. Again, prostheticgods@gmail.com. And if you want us to talk about something, or if you want to tell us how wonderful we are, or if you have ideas about who we should have on as a guest, just email us. If you want to tell us that we suck, keep it to yourself. We don't care.
That's right.
This is only positive vibes here.
All complaints go someplace else.
All complaints go somewhere else. That's right. Jay, we're talking about long-termism. You're puzzled about why I suggested this. So I'll say, why did I suggest it? One is because it's kind of been, and why does it belong in a sort of tech podcast? And my sense is that this is a theory that's gotten a lot of traction in Silicon Valley. We'll get into the definition, but very broadly, long-termism, as the name suggests, is this idea that we should take into account equally the interests of future people who are not born yet as the interests of ourselves who are here right now. And this has been influential for people like Sam Bankman-Fried, who is now listening to us from prison, and Elon Musk, who justifies both Neuralink and his interest in artificial general intelligence by this idea that for the survival of the species, or his whole trips to Mars obsessions, for the survival of the species, you have to come up with AGI, you have to come up with brain-computer interfaces, you have to come up with means to populate other planets. So this notion that we have to sort of shift policy to the interest of future people and take into account the interest of people who haven't been born yet has been influential, very influential, at least in the past in Silicon Valley. So I thought it's an interesting thing to talk about.
I don't think it's entirely true that this is a novel idea. I think people for a very long time have been implored and have sometimes committed themselves to projects that are beyond their own life. People that the interests of people that will not yet be born, but that you want to build the glorious kingdom for them at some point. You start building the cathedral. It's not going to be done for 400 years, but you know that someday it will be a glory to God. So I don't think the idea of working for the interests of future people is entirely novel. But the way that it comes out in consequentialist thinking, which is mostly Enlightenment thinking, is that if you say that you want to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number of people, there's a very strict way to interpret that, which is only the greatest good for the greatest number of currently existing people. That's called the person-affecting view. But that means that if you're like 95% sure that your kids are going to have a grandchild the next year or two, you don't have to care about that one because that one's not born yet. So I don't think very many people really believe that. I think we all believe that we probably should be taking future people into account somehow. And consequentialists are saying, look, how do we take them into account? And given that they are probabilistic people, what kinds of weights do we give to their interests or potential interests versus our own? And then the second question is, do we have any idea what we could do for them? With the existing people, we have, and right now, things that we could affect people right now, we have a better idea of what we could do for them. And so we have more moral obligations. But as time goes into the future, it becomes more and more uncertain what we can do for them. So Just in terms of the history of this idea, I think Reasons and Persons by Derek Parfit really laid some of the groundwork. He introduced the idea, for instance, of the repugnant conclusion, which is the idea in consequentialism. If I'm trying to create a world with maximum utility, and they have two options. One is a planet with 5 billion people on it, and they all live off of oatmeal gruel and, cheek to jowl, and a planet with 5 billion people on it, 50 billion versus 5 billion. And the 5 billion all have, glorious lifestyles. Still, the 50 billion, the small amount of pleasure that they have in their lives multiplied times 50 is greater than the 5 and the greater amount of pleasure that they have. And so that's called the repugnant conclusion, that consequentialism might lead you to the conclusion that we should want as many people as possible. So there's a direct connection to pronatalism in the way that people think about this, which is that in general, more people would be better because that's more pleasure-producing units in the universe, And then the flip side of that kind of calculation is, well, we can't know very much about the future because it's so uncertain and it's changing so quickly. But we do know that if all people were to be eliminated, that there would be no pleasure, right? So we have what's called in the calculations that these long-termists, these consequentialists do, they have what's called the Pascal's mugging, which is Pascal said, that even if there's a minuscule chance that God exists, that minuscule chance would pay off if God did exist because you have an infinite amount of suffering if you make the wrong choice here, whereas you have absolutely nothing to lose by betting on God. That's Pascal's wager. And Pascal's mugging is if you allow the human race to extinguish itself, then we know that there's be no pleasure, no utility in the future. And so even if we don't know what we can do other than that, stopping those existential risks, we know that that's a good thing to do. Everyone agrees that's a good thing to do. And then the question is, how much weight do you put on stopping existential risks or the threats to the existence of the human race in order to maximize that utility?
Yeah. So poor Pascal has has really been mugged with this one.
Yeah.
But to make this a lot more concrete, the long-termist, who is a kind of extreme form of utilitarian, the long-termist is saying something like, yes, it's true that, Jay wants to be a bioethicist or Jay wants to be a sociologist in the here and now. But his calculation for choice of profession, for example, should really take into account not his well-being or even his kids' well-being, but the well-being of the species moving forward. And almost any decision aimed at the next, generation sort of pales when you compare it to the open future. So if you want to be a sociologist, if you wanted to be a social worker, really what you should do is use your mathematical talents, which are considerable, to sort of, play in the stock market or be a broker, make as much money as you can, and give it to as many charities as possible.
So what I'm hearing you say, Nir, is that you should always pursue your selfish passions and never take the greater good into account. If you decide, I want to be a poet, but my country's at war and my family's about to be murdered, but I don't want to take up a gun, I just want to write poetry, you should never take up a gun. Is that what you're saying?
No. First of all, I'm describing the theory.
But I'm saying the theory says you should do things in other people's interests, that you have some obligation.
Well, the question is for how long of a time horizon, right? So the poet will suspend his passion for poetry for, a few years or a few months in order to take up arms for their country. But the long-termist tells the poet that there's always a war and there's always a country to save, and it never makes sense to be a poet. So long-termism is saying, in comparison to the endless sort of interests of the future, what is the weight of your poetry? It's nothing, and therefore you should become a stockbroker or something.
The idea of self-sacrifice for short or long term is not novel to consequentialism. It's not even novel to long-termism. Peter Singer is probably the consequentialist who's written the most about this. He's written, for instance, The Life You Can Save in 2009. And
And he's influential in this
he's
movement.
very
He's the kind
influential.
of
It's
one of
the
the
effective.
grandfathers of it.
Yeah, we'll talk about. I mean, effective altruism is basically the arguments that Peter Singer made for you. If you have a pot of money to spend to help other people, then you should spend it in the most rational way possible, and you should try to accumulate evidence about which charities or causes are going to alleviate the most suffering in the world. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable way to go about thinking about that. And he basically made the argument that above your own subsistence, almost all of the additional wealth that you have should be given ideally to others, because you could probably alleviate more suffering than your own, because there are people who don't have even subsistence in the world. So I consider that kind of the consequentialist proposition that we're all living in original sin, because to the extent that we all don't live as close to the bone as possible and give everything away, we are making a choice about what we should have in our own lives versus what we should give to the good. And I think every moral system has that, right? It's like it's no different if you're religious. It's like how much, and if you're Muslim, you're supposed to give 10%. I guess it's logical that the Muslim laws of charity are explicit about these things. But if it's more open ended, it's like, why aren't you giving it all away? Rich man don't get into heaven through the eye of a needle or whatever. So I don't think it's novel to say that you should make sacrifices for the public good. What's consequentialism is novel. It says there's a systematic way to think about which choices to make and what the good is.
Yeah, so I think this is probably a good time for us to become a little bit more specific and intentional about definitions, because there's a move here, right, from consequentialism to effective altruism to long-termism. So let me sketch it out for you and tell me if this sounds right. So utilitarianism or consequentialism, very, very broadly, this idea that the right thing to do is the thing that generates the greatest happiness for the greatest number, and what happiness is.
You can have different outcomes that you are seeking, but yeah.
Right. And what happiness is controversial in the history of utilitarianism. But broadly, rather than have pre-existing metaphysical duties to do X come hell or high water, you more non-dogmatically pursue the path that generates the best kind of result. A 21st century kind of, if you will, version of this, or late 20th century, 21st century version of this has been called effective altruism, and there's a mathematically and statistically informed version of utilitarianism where you should come up with objective metrics to measure where you put your effort, where you put your money, so that you get the most bang for your buck. And then long-termism is yet a third outgrowth of that one. And that says if you are genuinely concerned with generating the greatest consequences, since the future is so much longer than the present, since the future is infinite, really you should take into account the interests of the unborn generations forward in the way that you make policy. And once you start doing that, all kind of weird sort of almost science fiction like conclusions start making sense, like Elon Musk's obsession to going to Mars. You name that you should, if we're going to blow up the planet, you should invest resources in going to Mars, because that's going to serve best interest of future generations, etc. But even stuff like, don't take, maybe you shouldn't take global warming, for example, or climate change so seriously, because, the impact of focusing all of your resources on that compared to other policies which are compared is smaller, et cetera, et cetera. So just to finish that, just to finish one point, if the utilitarian and even the effective altruist says don't put a premium on geographical proximity, people on the other side of the world are worth just as much as you are, the long-termist says don't put a premium on temporal proximity, people unborn in the future are worth just as much as you are. So that's, as I see it, the lay of the land.
That's right. And that the similarity, or the equal weight between people that exist now on one side of the planet versus the other versus people now versus the future people. That's the key question is, should we be giving how much weight should we be giving to future people? Because I don't think there are very many people who think you shouldn't give any thought to the interests of future people. If you say, I want to use up all the resources in my lifetime, who cares about future people? You would consider that an immoral conclusion, right? I do want to mention that there are two books that people are interested that they should look to. One is The Precipice, Existential Risk and the Future of Humanity by Toby Ord. That was in 2020. And William McCaskill's What We Owe the Future in 2022. And they both explicitly address this argument that you do hear in the long-termist circles, because they're thinking about existential risks. And the difference between existential risk and a catastrophic risk is, if you look at the plague of 1917 to 1920 or whatever it was, the Great Plague of that period, or the Great Plagues of the Middle Ages, if you look at major catastrophic events throughout history, it slowed humanity down briefly, right? But it didn't slow us down that much. And so the consequence of something would have to be so dramatic that it set back human progress for a very significant period of time. And even that, in the full scope of human history, 200,000 years or whatever we think it is, even that would be a minor setback. But if everybody dies, that's a different situation, right? So for them, they're looking at how to think about the future in terms of, well, climate change, yeah, it might kill 1 billion, but that's just 1 billion. And then the other 6 billion will go on and do everything that we expected them to do, versus everybody dying. So I do understand the logic of the existential risk argument. I think it's hard to find anything that is truly an existential risk, though. I mean, the idea that something could actually wipe out all human beings, there's not very many things that we think could actually do that. But
yeah. I mean, this brings us to the fact that there's a genuine epistemological limit, namely of what we can know about the future, right?
Right.
It's a little bit hard to imagine what kind of risks are going to exist that are going to wipe out all of humanity and how seriously we should take them. I mean, this is supposed to be a practical, unless I'm misunderstanding something, this is supposed to be a practical doctrine. So this is supposed to say, all right, Dr. J. Hughes, you have, like I was saying, very good mathematical aptitude. Instead of wasting your time, on the podcast with Eisikovits here, you should be putting your time into modeling risk of the next pandemic. That's the long-termist view, right? Just like you should invest your resources in the most effective altruistic charity, you should invest your talents in the thing that's going to be best for the future.
Well, the IPCC reports are trying to project what the planet's going to look like in 2100 and what we can do now to make sure that things aren't terrible then. The Social Security Administration comes out with a report every year about how employment's going to look in 75 years and how that's going to affect the retirees. So I think we are obliged to be thinking about the future. The question is, as you say,
how long?
How long and how much certainty can we possibly give it? Whenever I look at the Social Security Administration's report, it projects out these anodyne projections about how things are going to change over the next 75 years that are completely absurd. And I think everybody who makes the report knows that they've never been correct, the ones that were done in the past, and they probably will be incorrect in the future. So the problem for long-termists and for consequentialism really is what's called cluelessness. You have no moral obligation to act if you have no idea whether your actions can actually affect the goal that you want to affect. And secondly, you may not even know what the goal should be. People in 100 years are going to have entirely different values. They're going to know far more about their situation. My argument is that beyond 2100 or something, I have so much cluelessness. I'm close to zero, a complete 100% cluelessness about the 22nd century that I don't want to give any advice to people. What I want is to make sure that the people exist. So I agree with the existential risk mitigation. And I want to make sure that they're as capable of changing their own affairs as possible. So I think a general commitment to freedom and liberal democracy is warranted. But again, the consequentialists could argue, look, if I could show you that dictatorship for the next 5,000 years is what's necessary to preserve the human race, Paul Atreides in Dune. If I could convince you that 5,000 years of dictatorship is what's necessary, that would be warranted in consequentialist terms. So,
yeah, and in long-termist terms. So really what we're thinking about is how long into the future do we have any sort of moral obligations, how intense those moral obligations
right.
are, and what they actually require in terms of investing our resources. I mean, sometimes both for Peter Singer and for people like McCaskill, my sense is that there's a bit of a slippage there, that they say, well, the just numerically the interests of the unending future outweigh our interest here, but just pay a little attention to it, which kind of just change your habits just a little bit so that you think about it just a tad.
Yeah, it's certainly true that for people in the Silicon Valley affluent set who have been attracted to these rationalist ideas and consequentialism, the majority of them, let's say, are liberal. The surveys have been done of effective altruists, the people who have committed to giving 10% of their wealth to rational causes in the world. They're all liberals, for the most part. But there is a warrant in this argument to say, my obsession with artificial intelligence and my belief that artificial intelligence is the key to the future warrants me not caring about climate change and only caring about the future of artificial intelligence and giving all my money to that cause, because that's going to have the greatest bang for the future.
Right.
So if you're someone who already doesn't want to give a crap about climate change, then yes, there's a warrant here to do that. I think there are also, however, many effective altruists and even long-termists who take seriously climate change because of what's known as kind of cascading lack of resiliency, that all of our systems, if everything begins to fray, it makes everything else fray, and all of civilization could collapse because we're so fragile at this point. And I think that's a legitimate concern too.
Yeah, that is. I guess let's bracket the people who use long-termism as an excuse, right? And sort of take the
sincere,
right, take the sincere long-termist, and the sincere long-termist would say, Jay, you should move 20% or 10% of your concern and resources from what's in front of your nose to long-term concerns about the survival of the species, etc. And is that problematic?
I don't think so. And I'm always puzzled why people find the quasi-monastic commitments of long-termism or effective altruism to be problematic, because in religious terms, the idea that people would make these kinds of long-term commitments for the good of all humanity and make odd choices. For the good of all humanity, I'm going to lock myself in this cave for 5 years and meditate. It's like, how is that helping anybody? Well, in my worldview, I'm doing this for the good of all humanity,
Right.
It's like this kind of logic is present all around us. These are people who are trying to think about it in at least a quasi-rational way.
Right. Well, locking in yourself in a cave is a question of, faith and belief, over which there's little argument. Here we are in the realm of argument. So I guess my first argument would be that even if we take your much more benign and moderate view of it, which is I have a serious obligation to care about things that are going to happen 100 years from now.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's problematic. A, because of what you said earlier, you genuinely don't know what's going to happen 100 years from now. So many things can happen 5 years from now that are going to completely revolutionize what happens 100 years from now, that maybe there's no point thinking 100 years forward. And secondly, there's the more interesting kind of, let's call it the brothers Karamazov kind of objection, where it's appropriate that you kind of referred to it as a monastic commitment. In the beginning of Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, there's this conversation reported where a person, if I'm remembering correctly, says to a doctor, I just love humanity so much, and I want to save everybody. But as soon as it comes to actual human beings, I want to cure diseases, I want to help the sick, I want to save the poor, blah, blah, blah. But if the doctor says, all right, you want to cure diseases, you want to help the sick, why don't you go change these soiled sheets and empty these bedpans? You're like, fuck that. That's gross. That's disgusting. Actual excrement of actually existing human beings. There's a bit of that dynamic going on as far as I'm concerned for long-termisms. There's a passion for humanity and a disregard for human beings. So my sense is a lot of the people who are very, very passionate about the next 100 years don't know where the closest prison is or don't know where the closest homeless shelter is. I think these do come at the expense of each other often.
Well, personalist ethics will get you so far, but not very far in thinking about big questions. I mean, it's like, yes, I think you should care about the people around you, but have you never had the thought when you've been panhandled on the street that I could give this dollar to you and you could use it for your utility, or I could contribute to, I always think about Bernie. I should give that money to Bernie because Bernie would do more for you than you would with this dollar.
Yeah.
I mean, we all have that calculation.
Right? I've certainly had the thought, but I guess for me at least, the thought goes as far as public policy in my country. And that's about it. Right. So I guess I want to shamelessly plug for the importance and the moral weight of proximity in moral concerns. That actually there are good reasons to have the intensity of your concern radiate more weakly the further away it moves from your own community and from your own time period.
Right. Well, we said that I would acknowledge that everyone is in some state of balance between what they understand to be their ideal moral commitments, which requires a lot of sacrifice, and the amount that they're willing to give. So we're all already making a moral calculation of how much of your own interests you're willing to sacrifice. And then there's the uncertainties about the future. So I don't think that we're kind of locked in here. I think we're all trying to struggle through the same question, which is if I don't think, it's like in terms of the difference between proximity. Do I think that the person who sacrifices two strangers to save their own child is a bad person? No. Do I think that it makes sense in consequentialist terms? Also, no. I mean, the trolley problem, even if it's your kid, the trolley problem says you should sacrifice your kid for 2 or 3 or 50 other people. And I think many people in military families understand that, right? They have decided to embrace and celebrate their children's putting themselves in the life of in the fire for everyone else, right? So I think we understand that many people don't want to make those sacrifices and that we generally don't. And we generally don't condemn people who put their own kids or their own proximate relatives above strangers. But Peter Singer's example that is the classic is you're walking by in a pair of $100 shoes and a kid is drowning and you jump in to save them even though you're going to ruin your $100 shoes. Okay, well, you were willing to make that sacrifice. Why wouldn't you give $100 then to save 50 kids drowning on the other side of the planet? Why isn't that an equally moral choice to make? Yes. And I agree with him. It is. You should make that choice. The fact that we don't means that we're all making a choice not to be ideally moral.
And the fact that the kid, just to spell that out for you, the fact that in one case the kid is drowning in front of you and in the other case it's an abstract kid, doesn't matter.
The kid, well, and that is the tragedy of empathy, is that we care more about the baby in the well than the 100,000 people who just drowned in Bangladesh. And that doesn't make any sense. It's a failure of, we grew up as monkeys living in caves with at most 150 people we had to keep track of. For us, as Yuval Harari points out with Sapiens, he says, look, it was a big leap for us to come up with ideas about nations and religions and languages and money that allowed us to cooperate as a species beyond 150 people. And those ideas have been a major structuring of the human race. And part of that is that we're at now is the expansion of the moral circle, so that we don't just take our family or our tribe as the only moral unit and the only moral subjects. We take all human beings, the entire other species as well, the expansion to other species as well in some way.
Mm-hmm.
And extending this to think systematically about future people, I think, is a natural extension of that.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. There's look, some expanding of the radiation of empathy, of the circle of empathy, you could say is the very definition of morality, right? Of the sort of move from beyond the immediately existentially relevant.
But your response is a typical conservative response. It's like, no. Family, nation, that should come before caring about people in Bangladesh.
It should come before, yeah. It shouldn't completely replace. I do think that it's appropriate that the radiation of empathy gradually weakens. I would like to see it gradually weaken rather than completely drop off. Yeah. So first of all, just descriptively, I think there is something nihilistic about the equation of value on the other side of the world and on the other side of time. Yes, that I think is problematic. And by the way, I think we're paying a bit of a political price for those kind of, that's the kind of rational core of truth in the so-called globalist critique, right? That people have been saying, maybe before you sort of worry about Davos and put your resources in sort of global institutions, you go and see what's going on in the more underprivileged parts of your own country.
Hold on. The logic here, the consequentialist logic, is what led the Gates Foundation to adopt methods of trying to figure out what their policy priorities should be like 20 years ago. And they did a study of all the different kinds of interventions. Their metric was saving lives. So that's one kind of consequentialist metric. How can we spend money to save the most lives? And their conclusion was that it was building traffic bumps in highways, in roads, because there's so many traffic fatalities in the developing world, and traffic bumps cost like $1 to build, and it slows all the traffic down. People don't die.
Yeah.
And that is precisely the kind of conclusion I want people coming to, right?
Yeah.
That don't spend all your money on stupid stuff, spend it on stuff that actually matters.
Yeah.
And I don't see why there's any argument about that.
You get zero argument from me about that, but then you just should start putting up the traffic bumps closer to home, and then gradually
only put them up in the States,
and then gradually expand outwards. That's the point I'm making. So, as an articulation of the argument, first of all, part of what I'm concerned about is that the effective altruist and that the long-termist is claiming that you should care equally about future people and about faraway people as about nearby people and existing people. I think that's problematic and unrealistic.
The reason I would endorse the logic of effective altruism is that I think that's defensible, that you should try to figure out, use your reason to figure out what's the best way to accomplish your compassionate goals in the world.
Exactly. But part of the reason is that we are, at least in part, still those creatures who can primarily relate to 150 people around us. So we haven't completely become AIs.
Our animalistic failings, but that's the is to ought. You're saying because we are animals who can't think systematically about the good,
we should try to think
therefore
systematically.
we should only accept the stupid ways we thought about it in the past. And it's like, no, that's the whole point of philosophy.
Yeah, I don't think they're stupid. And I don't believe in the is-ought distinction either. I think there's
your problem.
Yeah, I think they go back and forth. I think if you completely neglect the kind of being that you are in favor of a sort of permanent self-overcoming, you end up with the kind of ideologies that you like and the kind of guillotine that you are partial to.
Well, just let me finish the thought about effective altruism here, which is that the part about effective altruism I disagree with is they have particular understanding of how to accomplish the good and what the causes of bad things are, right? So with bed nets, bumps in the road, okay, fine. But if you're trying to figure out how do we keep people from dying from starvation, we've known for a long time there's enough food in the world. The problems are political, distributional, and so forth. And what kinds of political strategies and political actions are you recommending people take? Oh, none, because you just think all the problems should be solved with charity. That's the problem with effective altruism. It has a charity mindset. It doesn't engage with actual political change. I think you could be a socialist, come away with socialist conclusions as John Stuart Mill did. It's like, yes, we need to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number. And there are these political things we need to do to accomplish them. Now, the problem for me with long-termism, and I've written about this, and there'll be a link in the show notes, that epistemic uncertainty or cluelessness is so profound for me. The fog of the future is so thick that I don't think we have any idea what we should be doing right now for people beyond 2100 or whatever, and that means that we basically get to care about our kids and our grandkids. Our grandkids may live a very long time, by the way. My grandkids born in 2025, 2026 might live to be 200 or more. And so the time horizon for your grandkids is probably pretty long. But what you could do legitimately in the interest of your grandkids, you could set up a college fund for them, I suppose. But who knows if there's going to be college, right? The uncertainties about the rest of this century are big enough, not to mention the rest of the 22nd. So I just think there's no way we can know what to do.
Yeah. No, the future stupidity point, I think, is important. One example that kind of obviously pops up is that the long-termist German in 1839 would be encouraged to think about the interests of the Germans in 1939, and if that long-termist German in 1839 was a budding liberal, he probably would not want to serve the interest of the complacent fascist Germans of 1939.
Well, you know what a classic long-termist question is: would you kill baby Hitler?
Yeah. But
because
yeah,
you know what he's going to do.
Right. But let's play with an organizing sort of long-termist example and suggest two more critiques in addition to the unknowability of the future critiques. So a classic sort of long-termist exhortation is if you are passionate about becoming a teacher or a social worker or a sort of other publicly...
Again, you keep saying that occupational choice thing is actually a consequentialist question.
And the long-termist one, just in terms of the long-termist, it's an effective altruism. I mean, part of the problem is there's no clear distinctions between effective altruisms and long-termisms. They're versions of the same, where in one case the emphasis in effective altruism and consequentialism, the emphasis is on strangers, and in long-termism the emphasis is on future.
I'll put it this way. Every moral system says you should take the greater good into account in choosing an occupation, I think. Consequentialists say you should take it into account in a systematic way with numbers. And long-termists say you should take the trillions of yet unborn post-humans into account in terms of your occupational choice. And what SBF confessed to was that he was willing to do the distasteful dark work of hedge fund management or investment management, whatever, crypto, in order to make money that he could then give. So that's not long-termism. That's just consequentialism.
Let's believe him for a moment. I mean, he was full of shit. I don't think he really meant that. But let's assume he wasn't full of shit. For you as a socialist, there should be a problem with that, because that is a system that emphasizes personal choice rather than structural changes. It would be much more useful for the future and for strangers to say, rather than SBF should become a stockbroker.
What about the party?
Exactly.
We need the party.
Exactly. You certainly need the party. I just want to stay in my basement, but you need the party. So, it would be much better to tax people than to tell you to take your talents and go work on Wall Street. It would be better to tax the firms on Wall Street as a way to solve that. So it's an overly individualist theory, which I'm assuming you agree with.
I do, and yes, I've written that critique explicitly,
Yeah.
saying, look, if you take socialist debates seriously about race, class, and gender, for instance, there is a debate within the history of socialism about, is class the primary form of oppression? So if we just change this one thing about society, everything else would get better. Or are they equally and separate problems that you have to fix patriarchy and class at the same time?
Yeah.
That question is about the way the world works, and it's important if you are trying to reduce the amount of suffering in the world and you think that that suffering comes from oppression, you have to understand the way the world works. So there's no escaping consequentialist logic in any other policy or political sphere. And really, consequentialism is the only way within democracies to argue for policy, because if you just go in and say, you have to do this because it's the right thing to do, and I'm not going to give you any reasons why, people generally don't like that, although a lot of conservatives get away with it. And you could say maybe liberals get away with it too sometimes. But I think in general, in public policy, we argue the goal is reducing homelessness. This is the policy that we think will reduce homelessness.
Yeah. I mean, by the way, mentioning your withering critique of me earlier, consequential.
I just keep trying to figure out if you have a philosophy, because it mostly seems to be kvetching about everybody else's ideas.
Well, I mean, I think that's a time-honored philosophical move. So it's
you're Diogenes,
yeah.
You're just the skeptic with a lamp.
Yeah, I'm a skeptic with some retrograde impulses. If you're going to be a consequentialist, by the way, part of the circumstances that you probably need to take into account are some dispositional facts about the people you're considering. So it's weird to be a consequentialist without taking into account people's prejudices for proximity, isn't it? Your consequences are going to get messed up if you sort of pretend that people are totally different from
Again,
now
I'm stuck in the socialist mode, but just thinking about this question in relationship to socialism, people are committed to stupid national identities. What do you do about that when you're a socialist, a revolutionary international?
Because socialism worked out so well consequentially. Congratulations.
Blah, 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 blah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I know the history of the 20th century.
Yeah.
But okay, so
you're deep philosophical response to that critique.
But here's the dilemma. You're trying to build international class consciousness that unites all humanity as one species and get them to forget about their stupid national
I'm
identities.
In the other direction.
But you end up being Stalin, and you have to rule Russia across 50 different nationalities. What do? The fact that they're committed
to
stupid nationalities. Right. Well, you do that. You do that for sure. But you also say, look, you're already committed to these stupid nationalities, so we'll carve up some borders for you around your stupid nationalities and pretend that those things are real. You won't actually have any power, but we'll pretend that they're real. Marx said that the national question between the Irish and the British had to be solved before British workers could make any progress. They had to stop being part of an imperialist power structure and on both sides. So socialists have always had to deal with the fact that the pre-existing world is full of dumb, feudalistic things that we have to work around in order to get where we want to go. And how we work around them and how much compromise we make with that is part of that. So I'm not disagreeing. Yes, of course you have to take reality into account. But does it mean that you say that the choice to prefer your own children, that nepotism or preferring your own children live while others die, that is a moral choice? I think that's the question.
Yeah.
If you're willing to say that, then yes, we have a completely different moral system.
Yeah. I mean, by the way, imperialism is long-termist. And EA, effective altruist, et cetera, et cetera.
Marx said that imperialism was a necessary stage of capitalist development that would lead us all to the better world. So this, again, you can't escape consequentialism.
And I say, like Burke, drop the empire. You're doing too much harm. You can't sustain it anyway. The limb is too far from the heart. Focus on your own country and let other people figure it out. And, try to be charitable to them. If you're going to try to rule the entire world, you're going to end up killing millions of people. And it's never, and your great goals are in the end never going to be advanced.
Okay, newsflash. Nir is a conservative anti-imperialist, and I am a tentative supporter of colonialism on Marxist grounds, purely Marxist grounds. That's a necessary stage.
We started gaining listeners, but there it goes. Listen, I need to.
Yes, this is an illustration of the problem of future prediction. H.G. Wells was convinced that we would eventually get to a socialist, some would call it a fascist utopia. We would get to some kind of utopia, but only after a cataclysmic global war fought with world-ending weapons that he predicted in the 20s and 30s. And I think a lot of people have that kind of millennialist or apocalyptic sense that something that really bad has to happen for something good to happen. Now, if you really believe that, it could be in your consequentialist logic to say, I need to make something really bad happen. And that is, in fact, the logic of a lot of political movements. It's like terrorists, like the Red Brigades in Italy. It's like we just have to reveal the naked fascist power of the state by shooting at people until they come at us. And then they will reveal how terrible they are. You know, that kind of logic is baked into a lot of political thinking.
Yeah, but I think it's disgusting.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm an evolutionary socialist. I don't think you need to have catastrophe before you get.
So there you go. All you need to do is drop the socialist part, and we're on the same page.
Well, I don't want to get there with 10 billionaires owning everything at the top. That's the problem. That's the other part that these guys never look at. Is like they're all sitting around talking to each other about how they're going to improve the world for the future, while the world gets more unequal today.
Yeah,
and they don't pay any attention to the distribution of wealth.
That's right, because they don't get out and see what things look like in the neighborhood, in the town, in the state, in the next state over. It's only, it's like Rousseau said in the Discourse on the Origins of Inequality. If it's less than the future of the entire race, they don't give a shit. That's infantile. I do have one more. Sort of philosophical, if you will, question for it, emerging for a moment from my Diogenes mode here. So one critique of the long-termist and effective altruist kind of version of consequentialism is this, if you will, socialist critique, namely that they don't take structural factors seriously enough. And it's too much about individual decisions. Here's a different critique, though, and to me that's probably even a stronger one. And this critique tries to find the paradox in the argument itself. Why, if I'm Peter Singer or if I'm Will MacAskill, why am I supposed to worry about the interests of faraway or future people? It's because human beings are endlessly valuable, because there's a special value in human beings. This is not the sort of argument of the vegetarians that, in the end, it's all about sentient suffering necessarily. Well, why are human beings valuable enough to care about in the future and faraway places? They're valuable because we are decision-making, self-charting kind of creatures, right? And so John Stuart Mill, who both you and I like, one of the few people we agree on, his argument for utilitarianism is it's important for J and Nir to, figure out their own life, their own way, and be weird and be ridiculous, because that's still less harmful than the state telling them paternalistically what to do, right?
We know our own interests better than
right,
other people.
Exactly. And so, and the kind of beings who only feel a sense of meaning if they chart their own ways, even if they're making a mistake, right? So that's, that's the basic classical utilitarian, or at least classical liberal utilitarian point. And I guess the concern I have here, the paradox that I'm identifying here is if that's true, these theories keep telling us, rather than chart your own life your own way and figure out your own stuff, keep thinking about others that you don't know, that are far away, that don't exist yet. And so there seems to be a self-undermining argument here. There seems to be a self-undermining problem to the argument, namely, you are investing in strangers and in future people because they're so important. People are so important because they're special in this self-charting way, but I'm not going to let you self-chart because you have to invest in the future of faraway and future people who are important in this self-charting kind of way. Do you see the paradox I'm trying to point to?
Who's saying you have to? I mean, is it you saying you have to yourself?
No, the long-termists are telling me.
The long-termists tell you should think you should.
Yeah, the long-termist and the effective altruist are telling me, don't become a teacher, don't become a philosophy professor, because you have to use your talents in another kind of way to invest in the future of humanity. Humanity only matters because it's the kind of species that can, figure out what it wants to do. In the name of protecting humanity that matters, it's not letting me figure out what I want to do.
Look, when my daughter went to college, she did a 5-year program in opera and biology.
Yeah.
Guess which one I was enthusiastic about?
Okay. Opera, of course. I understand.
And she ended up a cell biologist, and she spent a lot of time on opera.
Yeah.
And it's like part of, I never actually said this, but every time I thought about the fact you could do so much more good for the world as a cell biologist than as an opera singer. God bless whoever goes into performing arts. It's a hard path to hoe.
Right.
But
as a utilitarian, you're committed to her making that mistake by herself, right? Like reaching that conclusion by herself. You can't sort of hoist it on her.
You're conflating two things. One is John Stuart Mill, yes, he said we should construct a society where individuals make as many choices as they possibly can.
Yeah, and Will MacAskill doesn't. Will MacAskill said all those individuals who want to be opera singers have to become stockbrokers so that people who aren't born yet will be happy.
Well, that's not true. I mean, MacAskill is basically a liberal. I mean, this is the problem, is that none of these writers are able to escape from the social and political assumptions.
All right, forget MacAskill. I don't want to scapegoat him. The best version of this theory says Jay's daughter can't become an opera singer if she's talented enough. The best version of every moral theory says you should take other people into account in your actions. A little bit, yeah, sure. A little bit, but
right?
This is saying a lot. And if part
of taking other people into account means you have talents to cure cancer, and instead you're over here singing opera, what the hell are you doing? That's not a consequentialist observation. Every moral system would make that observation,
no, it wouldn't.
Right?
No, it wouldn't. Utilitarian.
You don't think so?
No.
Every moral system celebrates selfishness over collective commitment.
Even the utilitarian shouldn't really celebrate that. Ask your buddy John Stuart Mill. Even under his thing, it would be you should reach the cure cancer conclusion by yourself, because otherwise you'll be so grumpy and miserable that you won't be curing cancer. You'll be looking for curing your own depression.
Look, just back to John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill writes both that our moral code should be to maximize the greatest good, which means that we have to be concerned about other people's good and make choices for our own lives in that interest. And that the logical conclusion of thinking about that is that we should maximize other people's freedom so that they can maximize their own good. Both things are consistent within that worldview, right? Now, if MacAskill were to say we should set up a dictatorial regime where everyone is assigned a job, which is an older socialist idea of the way things should be, and that would maximize the collective utility, there are people who believed that, right? That's not John Stuart Mill's argument. It's not MacAskill's argument.
Well, I think that Peter Singer and MacAskill stray from the John Stuart Mill version of utilitarianism, but then don't take their own conclusions seriously. I think that, Singer constantly does this. He does have actually some more totalitarian sounding conclusions, and then he doesn't commit to them because, he can't stomach them, right? The
problem with consequentialism, and Peter Singer is an exemplar of this, is if you take it seriously to its limit, you end up in some very troubling places. His writings about perinatal decision-making and euthanasia got him into trouble. But I think everything Peter Singer writes is perfectly consistent. But the idea that we should treat human children equivalent to the moral status of pigs is problematic for a lot of people, right? So we all cut corners ethically around the clear and crisp logic of consequentialism. Yeah. Anybody who's interested in consequentialism.
Yeah, but you weren't sitting there and telling your daughter, by the way, at the time, your choice of doing opera is immoral.
I didn't go that far, no. I just kind of squirmed.
Yeah, you squirmed to yourself, which is, I think, appropriate, and maybe I would have done the same. But the reason why you didn't go so far, I think, has to do with this kind of intuition that in the end, what's valuable about human beings in a liberal, from a liberal perspective, is the importance of self-realization, even if the realization is mistaken in some basic way. I think if you take these theories seriously, self-realization becomes a childish indulgence.
Sure. Self-realization can be a childish indulgence, and I think we have an obligation
But in politics, it's always compared to the alternative. So yeah, it can be, but compared to an alternative in which you're told how to realize, it's much better.
I'm a liberal. I believe that my socialism is also deeply rooted in liberalism. How do we maximize people's freedom?
I guess I'm trying to get you to agree to the fact that these theories, if taken seriously, are illiberal, even if the people who espouse them can't get beyond their bourgeois liberalism.
It's not constant. It's really any moral theory, if taken seriously, can be a warrant for illiberalism, right? Certainly, deontology can be a warrant for illiberalism. Virtue theory. I mean, what countries have the ministries of virtue? Iran, Taliban have ministries of virtue. So yeah, consequentialism can be a warrant for illiberalism. It can be a warrant for torture. If you're in the 24-hour scenario and the guy knows where the bomb is, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, that's been a problem of consequentialism since it was first articulated. And a lot of people have thought really hard about how to get around that problem. One way is to say, in general, we want some rules because we don't want to have to think about this every time. Should we be torturing people?
Yeah.
No.
And my sense is that the effective altruists and the long-termists take one further step towards the illiberalism, one step too many.
Not in their explicit prescriptions, in the logic of the moral weight of the future.
Yeah,
it is greater moral weight than consequentialists would.
Well, I mean, look, see how. And in a way, this goes back to what kind of motivated us to talk about this today. In the way it's actually playing out in some important parts of the economy and public policy, part of why this is such a preoccupation in the tech sector is this kind of, wise man's reordering of public policy on the basis of futurist consideration, like you get from Elon Musk's, but in fairness, not only the Elon Musk's of the world, right? This is why we have to have AGI. This is why we have to have brain-computer interfaces. This is why we have to have technology that will, take us out of the planet, etc.
Well, when a couple of weeks ago, you found out about the Zizians, this Charles Manson-like cult that grew out of the rationalists, the effective altruists, to some extent, long-termism. And they started killing people, and they have now gotten arrested, and hopefully that's the end of the Zizians. But the idea that they developed pretty classic signs of religious eschatology, religious millenarianism, which is something that you can see in the history of technological speculation for a very long time. People thinking that this is going to be the rapture, this is going to be the apocalypse, or whatever. Whenever people think about the future, especially the far future, it becomes religious eschatology. And when you brought up the Zizians to me a couple of weeks ago, my immediate response was, let me tell you about Christian Zionism, because Christian Zionists actually have nukes, and they're in the White House. And the Zizians are this tiny little group of like 12 people who have no influence on anything.
Yeah.
Now,
I'm anxious about any politics that has the hallmark of Christian eschatology or any eschatology.
Well, good, because I think we should be extremely conscious of eschatological influences in the way that we think about the future. And this is, whenever I bring this up, and I gave a paper last summer about this long-termism, and Peter Singer and other people in the audience, and I don't think that they were impressed, but partly because I leaned on this fact that whenever people talk about the future, it's eschatological. It's religious mythology. It's not actual, systematic speculation.
Yeah, it's people. But what I'm trying to get you to see is that it's quite often people who focus on the local, people who are explicitly committed to relatively limited, if not strictly and dogmatically limited circles of sympathy, they don't tend to cause a huge amount of harm.
People who have eschatological beliefs don't cause a huge
No,
amount
no,
of
no, the
harm.
opposite. People like me who say you start with the neighborhood, you move to the town, you move to the state lines, you consider perhaps the federation, the sort of Burkean view that's more considered with that's more focused on the local rather than the future of the species, the future of the entire world, the future of the whole continent, etc., etc. It's again the people who love human beings rather than humanity tend to be a little bit less dangerous.
Aren't you a Kantian in some way?
Nope.
Not at all. Okay.
No.
So you,
No.
okay, well,
No.
I don't know what to tell you, man. I do
Concrete
believe
commitments to concrete people. I like you,
I
even though I can't stand socialism, right? I like, hanging out in the neighborhood, etc., etc., etc.
I think you're conflating two things. One is the dangers of utopianism, and
And
especially
abstraction and eschatology.
right,
Yeah.
and the other is whether we should only care about kith and kin and not all of
Not kith and
humanity.
kin, but
Or
you start not only, but you start there. And you see how much energy you have left, and you push yourself a little, but you don't reverse it to say kith and kin is completely irrelevant. Let's just care about the idea of humanity in general, because that usually ends up in pretty problematic asshole-ish behavior. I mean, that's the basic insight there from that little Dostoevsky example. That beginning from the abstract seems to quite often indicate a lack of capacity to care for the concrete.
I think I'll make another connection here. There's a classic Chinese story about a guy who becomes a monk and does a very long retreat, and he's in a silent meditation when he's dying, and his mother comes to want to see him for the very last time, and he refuses to see her. And at least in the circles that I first heard those stories, that his sacrifice was celebrated because he was upholding his commitment to his vows over his desire to see his own mother. And so people were like, "Oh my God, that's a real monk, the one who doesn't see his mother right before he dies."
Yeah. I would want
And so
nothing
I
to
think
do
there's
with that.
different, right? Well, but I mean, let's not. I don't want to get ethnic about this, but I mean, there are different societies have different cultural
Yeah.
codes, and some are more universalistic than others. Buddhism and Hinduism. Well, Hinduism not so much because it's about Indians, but Buddhism was an imperialist religion, so it celebrated the equal, and the Roman Empire was I think the beginning of some of this for the West. It's like if you become a Roman citizen, all Roman citizens have X. So this idea of political and moral universalism is not just the Enlightenment, but it is definitely a tenet of the Enlightenment I'm very committed to. And I think, yes, that is one of the reasons people don't like the Enlightenment, because it says you should care about everybody equally.
Yeah, yeah. Well, maybe we can end this segment with another reference to mothers, and this is with our, old friend Camus, who, sort of makes the opposite point that if it comes down to it, and it usually doesn't, to a choice between his mother and the motherland, he would always choose his mother. And I think that's where my moral instincts lie too. But most often, by the way, I think that's a false dichotomy.
Yeah, there are very rarely those kinds of moral trade-offs.
Yeah.
Usually what's in your family's interest is also in your society's interest.
And yet what I guess I am committed to is that the better path to caring about humanity with a capital H is a training in caring about the actual human beings around you. So, decency, if you will, rather than a commitment to principle, would be my moral intuition.
I think there's a political rationale for what's called the person affecting view. Well, I'll just throw this out there that if your goal is to change the world today and you're really uncertain about the future, then thinking about making an argument on behalf of the interests of the people who exist now, it makes more sense than hypothetical future people. So, I mean, in practice, I think we're pretty close. It's just what the moral underpinnings of the argument are.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think what initially sort of one of the first sort of philosophical examples, like I mentioned to you, that got me to think about this is that famous passage from Rousseau where he's saying there's a fight in the street, and the philosopher in their room is sort of looking down to the fight in the street and saying, the commoners, the hoi polloi are fighting again. Screw it. If it's not the fate of the whole world, I couldn't give a shit. And as he says, the people of the market or the fish sellers, or I don't exactly remember what kind of comment he says, are the first ones who sort of rush to separate the people who are fighting. Namely, not only do you not need to be a philosopher or a moral theorist to sort of end that fight, it potentially even gets in the way. I always thought that was kind of compelling. So should we talk a little bit about the great questions of the news?
Sure.
All right. So now that we've solved long-termism, ChatGPT 5 just came out.
Yes.
And passions are running very high.
They are. It's intensely polarized. I think there was a lot of hype about ChatGPT 5. The speculations a year or two ago about what it might end up being were close to, the end goal of AGI, hard takeoff of superintelligence or something like that. And it is definitely not that. The things that it is a way of systematically they put a front end on it so that when you ask your question, it tries to figure out which of the different kinds of ChatGPT are the best to use. And that way they can, if it's a simple query, like, what are the 3 most popular toothpastes, it only sends it to the dumb one and it's good enough. But if it's a complicated query, it's supposed to go to the smart one. So one of the things that happened when this was rolled out 10 days ago was that wasn't working very well, and everybody got the dumb answers because the dumb answers are cheaper.
Right. They use less computing power.
Right. So everybody got the dumb answers. They said, oh, we screwed up, and they started rerouting things, and people are more satisfied. It also showed charts that were absolutely comical in terms of bars that were exactly the same height but with different percentages and so on and so forth. So its ability to do things was questioned immediately. In terms of the benchmarks, math benchmarks, coding benchmarks, and things like that, it is an improvement over the previous models. It can stay on task longer if you give it a task that takes like 2 hours. It can go that long before it fails, whereas previous models had a shorter time span. And it is cheaper as an overall configuration of ChatGPT. And it does pass some of the knowledge tests, like the bar exam. I think it just got 100%. So, various kinds of exams, it's doing better than the other models. So the people who were looking at those kinds of things really like it. I don't think most of the people who use it on a daily basis noticed that much of a difference, but some people got very attached to the sycophancy of ChatGPT 4. And so one of the things that OpenAI had to do is roll back and give people access again to choosing which model that they are going to use, because the sycophantic model turned out to be precisely what a bunch of people wanted.
Yeah.
And when it got terse and informative, they were like, give me back my old one that thought
my sycophantic baby is gone.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I'm not quite sure how I feel about that, because I think less sycophancy is a lot better than more sycophancy. But I think people are also beginning to think, well, look, we want these for different purposes. If you want a therapist, your therapist doesn't that often abuse you. I hope, at least in general. I don't know, because I'm a guy averse to therapy, but in general, they don't abuse you. But if you go to some other person, you want a more objective opinion. So perhaps there should be 2 different kinds of models, one that's completely objective and one that's sycophantic.
Yeah. Highlighted some interesting kind of sociological trends about the use of these models. First is, so as you were saying, OpenAI eliminated this model selector where you could choose what kind of model gave you the answer, and said we will choose it ourselves based on the prompt, right? And turns out that people don't trust that it's actually you can only pull that off if people trust your product, right? Rather than assume that you just go to the cheapest way of generating an answer. And it looks like people don't trust the product. It looks like people are very suspicious of the product and saying, why would you give me the best answer if it's expensive and so on.
I think it's kind of like MAGA in that there can be a week of bad news that we're very plugged into that has absolutely no impact on the people that it needs to have an impact on. It's like there are a billion people using ChatGPT around the world right now. How many of them are plugged into, oh, the switcher was giving me cheaper answers or whatever? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think that this controversy has done much more than scare the business class about the investments. Half of the economic growth in the last year since Trump was elected has been data center and power center construction. I don't know, $400 billion of whatever the investment that has occurred.
Yeah.
So this is a huge driver in our economy, and anything that pops the AI bubble and calls into question these massive investments that are being made is more than a sneeze. It's a tsunami. So I think the fact that Open AI ran into these troubles this week is at least temporarily a very cold draft across, the Open AI the AI enthusiasm.
Yeah. And the other thing that I was thinking as I was watching how strong the reactions to it were is that I think they just created so many expectations from each iteration of the model by all the AGI hype that their product, couldn't even, in theory, live up to them. Because in some ways, it's a pretty remarkable product. Made.
I use it.
Yeah, and I think it is an improvement, actually. For the first time since using ChatGPT, starting to use ChatGPT in 2022, I feel that this is actually becoming a pretty helpful tool to me in my own, like in planning a syllabus. I had pretty long conversation with it, and I got some pretty interesting insight on some pretty good brainstorming or AI storming on book selections, which I couldn't have imagined would be the case. And I view it as a very sophisticated way to search the internet and search databases, which you then have to verify before you do anything of consequence with it. But it's a better way to search the internet than existed before, or at least a better way to start your searches. It saves some time. Of course, if you keep sort of thinking that this is, going to be the AGI that changes the very nature of consciousness, it's going to keep being a letdown. And Altman and his buddies have nobody to blame but themselves for that, in my sense.
Well, there was an interesting controversy. It's micro controversy, but kind of illustrative, between Gary Marcus, who's one of the chief critics, NYU emeritus professor, author of many books and so forth, who is one of the chief skeptics about AGI. Skeptics in the sense that he's argued that LLMs, the large language models, can't get
not this way.
And I've thought probably he was correct. I'm not a computer scientist, but that basically what we have now is a couple lobes, like the Broca's area or whatever of the neocortex that control all the language. We have this kind of condensed internet in this language model. But we don't have all the other stuff that goes on.
That just making larger and larger language models isn't going to get us to AGI.
Right, exactly. Right. Whatever extra sauce needs to come from other architectures. And Gary Marcus is a partisan of other architectures. So he thinks we're going to get there.
Yeah.
And he thinks we'll probably get there within the next 10 years,
yeah.
but have something that looks like, a self-autonomous robot.
And who's on the other side of the controversy?
Well, there's a guy, David Shapiro, who I've been, I don't know if he knows who I am, but I've been thinking about reaching out to him because he's an advocate. He's like a self-taught AI guy and a big YouTuber. But he's one of the chief evangelists of the coming of a workless society. He doesn't want the state to establish a UBI. He wants to do it through crypto and land redistribution. He's got various unique ideas. But anyway, they got into a tiff last week on Twitter, and it's like this guy doesn't have anything in terms of the credentials compared to you, Gary Marcus. Why are you arguing with this guy? But it's because the AI hype is so powerful out there. The people, the religious fervor about what AI could do for us is so strong that the hypesters and the religious are at war. And this was definitely a victory for the anti-hypesters, the Gary Marcuses.
Yeah, I mean, it has a bit of the same dynamic that Apple product releases used to have. That just releasing something that works very well and does a few cool things is no longer an acceptable part of the market if you keep trying to convince and persuade people and have them expect life-changing products.
Well, one of the analyses of the effects of automation or computers on productivity says, look, between 1980 and 2000, there wasn't a lot of evidence that computers were improving productivity. What happened in 2000 was that everyone got hyped up about Y2K, and they had to replace all this legacy software. So there's all this implementation of software in 2000. And there's some suspicion that we need to, it's like the Kuhnian scientific revolutions. Just because you have the new idea doesn't mean that everyone's going to buy your new idea. A lot of people have to die before this new idea is going to take off, right? And it's kind of the same with computers. It's like, when I came into UMass Boston, there was one person I needed data from, but they refused to do anything with PeopleSoft. They would put it in an Excel spreadsheet and only give it to me that way. That person literally had to retire before I would get it in PeopleSoft.
So what's the AI analog of this?
Well, the AI analog is that the AI there may already be something in some lab someplace. We don't know how to implement it. And there's always a hype curve where people are saying, look, in 5 years, we're going to get here. And so we should be hyped. Mm-hmm. But then there's the trough of disillusionment. And then where there's actual progress being made towards the implementation, but instead of 5% of tasks being automated, it's now 10% of tasks. And then next year it's going to be 15%. We didn't go from 5 to 25 or whatever it was. So I still think we're on a trajectory of automation with AI, whatever that looks like. And I suspect it's going to result in technological unemployment. But I think for them to have suggested that within the next 2 years, we were going to see dramatic technological unemployment, that was overblown because people just don't adopt technology that fast.
Yeah. I just think we're swimming in the trough of disillusionment. I like that. I think if we need a new name for the podcast, it
You'd like us just to stay there. You want to put a little marina around it and just everyone stay in the trough of disillusionment.
Exactly. Put up lanes so you could float on your back. Yeah, we should rename the podcast The Trough of Disillusionment. Okay, see you next time in The Trough of Disillusionment.
Hype Master Captain out.